There are nights in a man's life when the cold doesn't just sting his skin, but digs its way through the layers of his flesh and settles so deeply inside his bones that he begins to wonder whether morning is something meant for other people. And as I curled behind the abandoned train station that winter night, my back pressed against a graffiti-stained concrete wall that leaked freezing air through every crack, I realized with a quiet, painful certainty that I had become one of those people who no longer belonged to the world that moved in warmth, in light, in safety. My name, once spoken proudly in offices and around dinner tables, had become something I rarely said out loud anymore, because when you have been homeless long enough, your identity feels like another thing the cold has stripped away, and all that remains is a body trying to make it to sunrise. The wind that night moved with a cruelty I had never experienced, slicing down the length of the tracks and whipping through the holes in my shoes until my toes felt like pieces of stone barely attached to my feet. I had exactly one possession that could still be called mine, a thin, patchy gray blanket I had pulled from a donation box months earlier, and although it barely kept the cold from piercing my skin, it was the single barrier between me and the kind of night that steals breath from lungs silently. I wrapped myself in it tightly, closed my eyes, and told myself to endure a few more hours, that I would survive this night the way I had survived the others, even as my fingers shook violently and the ache in my stomach from 2 days without food pulsed like a slow, steady drum. But just when I thought the night had taken everything from me, I heard a sound so out of place in that dead, frozen darkness that at first I thought I imagined it. A small, trembling whimper, soft and frightened, like a wounded animal trying not to be heard. I forced my eyes open and looked toward the dim glow of the distant street lamp, and that was when I saw her. A tiny child, no older than 5 or 6, standing alone near the far end of the platform. She had no coat, no gloves, no hat, just a thin dress that fluttered violently in the wind, her arms wrapped around herself as she shook uncontrollably. She looked lost, terrified, and unbelievably fragile, a small figure swallowed by the cold in a way I had only seen in my own reflection. Yet somehow worse, because a child should never know this kind of night. I didn't think. I didn't debate. I didn't weigh my options between survival and compassion, because something inside me, perhaps the last remaining piece of the man I used to be, refused to let a child freeze in front of me. My body protested with every weak step as I approached her, but when I finally knelt beside her, her eyes lifted wide and glistening with fear and exhaustion. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her shaking told me enough. Without hesitation, I unwrapped the only blanket I had, the one thing keeping me alive, and draped it around her tiny shoulders, pulling it close around her shivering body. The cold crashed against me instantly, shocking my skin, tightening my chest, stealing what little heat I still had. But the moment her trembling slowed, even slightly, I felt something warm flicker inside me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. She looked up at me with an expression I couldn't read. Gratitude, confusion, maybe disbelief that anyone would help her. And then, just as I opened my mouth to ask where her parents were, she turned and ran. I called out, worried she might fall or vanish into the night, but her small figure darted between the pillars, swallowed quickly by the swirling frost, and within moments she disappeared as though the darkness itself had taken her. I stood there stunned, the cold attacking me mercilessly now that my blanket was gone. And when I took a step toward the direction she had run, my vision blurred, my legs faltered, and an overwhelming wave of dizziness washed over me. The ground rushed up faster than I could catch myself, and I collapsed onto the icy concrete with a force that knocked the air from my lungs. I tried to push myself up, tried to breathe, tried to survive, but the cold wrapped its fingers around me and pulled me downward, and as everything began to fade, the last thought I had was that giving her my blanket had been worth it, even if it cost me my life. When my eyes finally opened again, I expected to see frost, concrete, the fading light of dawn. But instead, I found myself lying beneath a ceiling so high and polished it reflected the soft glow of an ornate chandelier. My body rested on silk sheets, warm and impossibly soft, and as I stared in confusion at the golden drapes and marble floors around me, one terrifying, impossible question formed in my mind. How had I gone from freezing behind a train station to waking up inside a billionaire's mansion? I wasn't supposed to survive that night, yet here I was, in a bed that looked like it cost more than everything I had lost. So who brought me here, and why? When I finally woke up fully, if waking is even the right word for the slow, disoriented climb my mind made back into consciousness, it felt as though I had surfaced from the bottom of a frozen lake, gasping for air I wasn't sure I deserved. And as my vision cleared just enough to separate shapes from shadows, I realized with a sudden jolt of fear that nothing around me resembled the world I had fallen asleep in. The bed beneath me was impossibly soft, swallowing my weight like a warm cloud, the sort of surface that belonged in magazine spreads or luxury hotels I had only seen from the outside. White sheets lay tucked perfectly around me, heavy and smooth like polished silk warmed by sunlight, and the faint scent of lavender drifted through the air. Utterly foreign compared to the metallic bite of winter I had blacked out in. My heart thudded violently inside my chest as my eyes darted across the room, attempting to anchor myself to something real, something familiar. But everywhere I looked, I saw elegance and wealth. High ceilings adorned with intricate moldings, gold-trimmed drapes that cascaded down the walls like waterfalls of fabric, and furniture carved so delicately it looked more like art than something meant to be used. A crystal chandelier hung above me, scattering tiny flecks of light across the room each time it swayed ever so slightly. And for a terrifying moment I wondered if I had died and woken up somewhere I didn't belong. I pushed myself up, but my limbs felt heavy and unresponsive, as though my body still remembered the cold it had succumbed to. The room spun slowly, a reminder that I had been on the brink of death only hours before, or however long it had been, and panic surged through me with a ferocity that forced a ragged breath from my throat. I had no blanket, no tracks, no concrete wall behind me. Instead, I was surrounded by wealth on a scale I had never touched, never imagined touching, and the question clawing at my mind became impossible to ignore. Where am I, and who brought me here? Before I could gather enough strength to stand, the door on the far side of the room opened with a quiet, controlled click, and a tall man stepped inside, moving with the kind of polished confidence that only people with old money and global power ever carry. He looked to be in his late 50s, with perfectly trimmed silver hair, sharp eyes that missed nothing, and a presence so commanding it seemed to reshape the air around him. He wore a dark, tailored suit, the kind that fit so expertly it didn't wrinkle even when he moved, and he held his hands behind his back as he walked toward me, as though observing something he had been waiting to see. The moment his gaze met mine, I felt something inside me constrict violently. He wasn't looking at me with curiosity or suspicion, the way a stranger might when finding someone unexpected in their home. He looked at me with recognition, with assessment, almost with disappointment, or was it relief? I couldn't tell, and the uncertainty tightened into fear. "What is this?" I whispered harshly, my voice cracking. "Where am I? Why am I here?" The man didn't answer immediately, and the silence stretched long enough to make my pulse race in my neck. He simply pulled a chair beside the bed and sat down with the kind of calm that suggested he had rehearsed this moment in his head long before it happened. That terrified me more than anything else. "I'm sure you're confused," he began, his voice deep and smooth, like someone accustomed to being listened to. You were found near the tracks last night, unconscious, severely hypothermic. You didn't have a pulse for several seconds." His words hit me like a punch, but before I could respond, another thought crashed into me with unstoppable force. The child. The little girl with shaking shoulders and frightened eyes. The one I had wrapped my blanket around. The reason I was dying in the cold. I closed my eyes, memory flooding back so vividly that the warmth of the silk sheets felt sickening against my skin. I remembered her small frame disappearing into the night, the cold consuming me seconds later, the ground rushing up. I remembered thinking that at least she had a chance, that at least she might survive. I opened my eyes sharply. "The girl! Where is the girl?" I demanded, fear scraping through every word. "The child I helped. Did someone find her? Is she safe?" The man's expression changed, but so subtly I almost missed it. A flicker of something raw, something deeply personal, passed through his eyes before he leaned slightly forward, studying me in a way that made my skin prickle. "Why?" he asked slowly. "Did you give her your blanket?" The question shattered me. Out of all the things he could have asked, my name, my story, what led me to the tracks, he chose the one question that carried the deepest truth, one I hardly understood myself. I opened my mouth, unsure whether to tell him that kindness was the last piece of myself I had left, or that I couldn't bear the thought of any child suffering the way I had, or simply that she had looked so alone it hurt to breathe. Before I could answer, he exhaled deeply and stood, pacing once before turning back toward me. "The child you helped," he said, his voice tight with emotion he couldn't quite hide. "Wasn't just any child." He paused, and the room seemed to grow impossibly still. "She was my granddaughter. And I need to know," he continued, stepping closer with eyes that suddenly burned with something fierce and unsettled, "why a man with nothing chose to save the only person I have left." For a long moment after the billionaire spoke those words, "She was my granddaughter," I could only stare at him, my mind unable to wrap itself around the enormity of what he had just said. And as the silence stretched between us like a taut wire threatening to snap, my thoughts spun wildly, colliding with one another so violently it felt as if the room were tilting beneath me. The child, the tiny girl shivering alone in the freezing night, the one I had thought was lost or abandoned or forgotten by a world too busy to notice her absence, belonged to him, to this man whose presence commanded entire rooms, whose clothes were worth more than everything I had owned in my entire life, whose life was so far removed from mine that the two worlds should never have collided at all. And yet they had, because fate or tragedy or sheer accident had let her wander into the shadows where I lived. He took a slow breath, steadying himself as though the story he was about to tell required more strength than he was used to showing, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was controlled but carried an undercurrent of something raw, something almost broken. "She slipped away from her security team last night," he said, pacing near the foot of the bed, his hands clasped behind him in a gesture of helplessness, masked as discipline. "We were hosting a private event. Too many adults, too many distractions. She wandered off and no one noticed until it was too late. I tried to imagine it. A mansion full of polished shoes and clinking glasses, a child drifting unnoticed through hallways until she reached the cold night air. But the image felt surreal, distant from the world I inhabited." He continued, "When we realized she was missing, every camera, every guard, every resource was mobilized. We searched for nearly 40 minutes before someone spotted her near the train station." He stopped walking then and turned toward me, and in the dim morning light filtering through the curtains, I recognized a kind of fear in his eyes that no amount of wealth could protect a person from. "When they found her, she wasn't shivering anymore," he murmured, "because she had a blanket wrapped around her. Your blanket." The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier, as though my lungs needed permission to keep breathing. I could still see her tiny figure disappearing into the night, the blanket dragging behind her as she ran, and the memory carved itself deeper into me now that I understood she had been running back to warmth and safety, not into danger as I had feared. He moved to a table near the window and picked up a small remote, pressing a button that lowered a large screen on the wall. A few keystrokes later, a grainy security video filled the display, footage from a camera mounted somewhere near the station. I watched as a version of myself, thin, shivering, unsteady, approached the child slowly, wrapping her in my blanket with the gentleness of someone afraid she might break. I saw myself speak to her softly, kneeling at her level, offering the only thing I had left in the world. Then I watched her run. I watched me collapse. I didn't realize tears had begun to gather in my eyes until my vision blurred, and I lifted a shaking hand to wipe them away. The billionaire stood silently beside the screen, not speaking, not rushing me, not judging the raw emotion spilling out of someone society barely acknowledged. Finally, after several moments, he turned off the screen and pulled the chair closer to the side of the bed. "Why did you do it?" he asked again, quieter now, the earlier edge replaced with something almost tender. "You had nothing. Nothing. And yet you gave her the only warmth you had left." It was a simple question, one he had a right to ask, and yet answering it felt like ripping open wounds I had spent years trying to bury under layers of numbness and survival. I inhaled shakily, lowering my gaze to my hands cracked from cold, scarred from labor, trembling from exhaustion, and began to speak in a voice that felt too small for everything it carried. "I wasn't always like this," I said, and the words alone triggered a flood of memories. My old apartment, my job I'd once taken pride in, the people I lost, the choices I made out of desperation. I used to have a life, a good one even. I had a job, a fiancé, a future I believed in. But life doesn't always fall apart loudly. Sometimes it crumbles piece by piece, so quietly you don't even realize how close you are to losing everything until the last piece slips from your fingers. He listened without interrupting as I told him about losing my job, being unable to pay rent, sleeping in my car until the car was repossessed, sleeping on benches until the benches became too dangerous, losing the woman I loved because she couldn't watch me drown any longer. I confessed how shame had swallowed me, how fear had suffocated me, and how giving up had almost become easier than fighting. When I finished, there was a stillness in the room so absolute I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. The billionaire leaned back slowly, his expression softer, almost pained, not pity, but understanding, as if my story struck something personal inside him that he hadn't expected. "You didn't lose everything," he said quietly. "Not really. Not if kindness like that still lives in you." I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know how to accept that someone like him, someone with wealth, power, influence, could see value in someone like me. He stood up suddenly, smoothing the front of his suit with steady hands. "There's something important I need to show you," he said, his voice low but resolute. And before I could ask what he meant, he turned toward the door. "Follow me," he said, "because what you're about to see will change everything you think you know about that night." I followed him out of the bedroom with legs still unsteady, as though the warmth of the sheets had not yet convinced my bones that they were no longer locked in battle with the cold that had almost consumed me. The hallway outside was impossibly long, lined with polished wood so rich and glossy it reflected the soft overhead lights like a river of dark honey. And as the billionaire walked ahead of me with slow, deliberate steps, I felt as if I were drifting through someone else's dream, moving through a world not built for me, a world I would never have been allowed to touch under any ordinary circumstance. Everything looked handcrafted, curated, elegant in a way that made my presence feel like a stain I couldn't scrub off. Yet he never once looked back at me with doubt or hesitation. Only purpose as though he knew exactly why I needed to see whatever lay ahead. We passed rooms I couldn't begin to imagine explanations for. Libraries with shelves rising 3 stories high, filled with leather-bound books that smelled faintly of age and wisdom. Parlors with antique chandeliers and orchestral music playing so softly it felt like the house itself breathed rhythm. A sunroom where winter light gathered in peaceful golden pools on marble floors, warming plants I didn't even know the names of. The deeper we walked, the smaller I felt. Not because he made me feel inferior, but because this place was a museum of a life built from generations of wealth, while I had come from a night spent fighting for survival on frozen concrete. As we turned into another corridor, one lined not with ornaments or modern art, but with framed photographs, I slowed unknowingly, my gaze pulled toward the images, like gravity itself had shifted. The pictures were vibrant, tender, filled with faces that seemed to glow with the warmth of memories frozen in time. In many of them, a young woman appeared, a woman with striking, luminous eyes, and a smile that looked as though it had been carved from sunlight. She held a toddler in her arms in some photos, stood on a beach with bare feet in others, laughed with her father, the man walking ahead of me, beside a decorated Christmas tree, or sat on a piano bench with her hands resting gently atop the child's small fingers. I felt an unexpected ache as I studied the photographs more carefully, because the resemblance between the child in the pictures and the girl I had wrapped my blanket around was undeniable. The same gentle eyes, the same soft curls, the same delicate shape of her face that made her look like she had been painted with kindness rather than inherited it. It became painfully clear that the child I had saved was not just the billionaire's granddaughter. She was the echo of the daughter he had lost. He paused as he realized I had stopped walking and turned back to find me staring at the wall of memories. His expression shifted, softening with something between sorrow and resignation, as though every smile in those photos carried a weight that pressed on him every day. He approached slowly, placing a hand on the frame of one picture where the young woman sat on a picnic blanket, sunlight catching strands of her hair, the toddler laughing in her lap. "My daughter," he said quietly, the simple words carrying more grief than if he had spoken 1,000. "She passed away 3 years ago. Car accident. Drunk driver." His jaw tensed, his eyes flickering as though battling memories that clawed at the edges of his composure. She was everything this house had left of softness. I didn't interrupt or offer condolences. Nothing I said could possibly fill that void, and sometimes silence is the only language grief understands. He inhaled deeply, continuing in a voice that trembled despite his strength. "Her daughter, my granddaughter, looks just like her. Same smile, same stubbornness, same way of wandering where she shouldn't." A faint, bittersweet smile touched his lips, vanishing almost instantly. "So when I saw her wrapped in your blanket, when I saw the way you held her as if she were your own, it reminded me of her. Reminded me that goodness still exists in places I stopped looking." We resumed walking, and soon we reached a vast living room where tall windows framed the winter landscape outside, snow dusting the trees like powdered sugar. The staff moved quietly around the space. Housekeepers, cooks, maybe a butler, each occupied with tasks that looked practiced and precise. But what startled me most was the way they looked at me when the billionaire entered the room with me in tow. Not with suspicion or disdain, not with the tight politeness reserved for outsiders, but with a certain warmth, a respectful curiosity, almost as if they already knew something about me I didn't yet understand. A young maid offered me a gentle smile, a gesture so foreign to someone like me that I almost stepped back from it. "You're wondering why everyone's treating you this way," the billionaire said, noticing my hesitation. "It's because I told them what you did. I told them you saved her life." I lowered my gaze, discomfort blooming in my chest. Because the last thing I had done for that child was save myself by giving up the tiny scrap of warmth I had left. But he shook his head with a firmness that silenced the shame forming inside me. You gave her the blanket without knowing anything about her, without expecting anything in return. That kind of kindness, he said, his voice filled with conviction, is not something money can buy, nor is it something I see often, not even in this house. He let those words hang in the air between us before gently placing a hand on my shoulder, guiding me toward a sitting area near the fireplace. The crackling flames illuminated the room with a soft glow that made everything feel strangely intimate, strangely safe. He paused, studying me with an expression I couldn't decipher. Curiosity mixed with gratitude, mixed with something deeper, almost like duty. There's a lot you don't know yet, he said finally, his tone shifting to something more intentional, more decisive. And before I explain everything, I need you to stay here for a few days, as my guest. He leaned back slightly, watching my reaction. Will you stay? He asked quietly. Because there's something important you need to understand about why you're here. The next morning unfolded with a strangeness so gentle and foreign that for several minutes after opening my eyes, I lay completely still, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter the fragile peace surrounding me. The room was warm, sunlight slipping through the tall windows in long, soft beams that stretched across the polished floor like invitations to a world I didn't belong to. For months, my mornings had begun with cold biting into my skin, with hunger gnawing so viciously that I woke dizzy and hollow, with the sound of distant trains or passing footsteps reminding me I lived in a world that kept moving even when I couldn't. But this morning, the first breath I took didn't burn my lungs, and when I placed a tentative hand on my stomach, I felt no sharp ache, no twisting emptiness, only a quiet, unfamiliar calm. A soft knock sounded at the door before it opened slightly, revealing a woman in a crisp uniform, holding a tray that seemed impossibly full. The smell reached me first. Warm bread, fresh fruit, eggs cooked in a way I could never afford even at my best, and coffee whose aroma curled through the air like a promise of life, returning to my body. She approached with a kindness that unsettled me, because kindness offered without suspicion or pity rarely belonged to the world I inhabited. Yet she set the tray gently on the table beside my bed and offered a warm smile, as though serving a stranger who had nearly frozen to death was the most natural act in the world. "I thought you might be hungry," she said softly. Hungry wasn't even the word. I was starved, not just for food, but for gentleness, for dignity, for the feeling that my existence mattered to someone. Still, when I reached for the bread, my hand trembled, and I had to blink several times to keep my vision from blurring. I ate slowly at first, not wanting to appear desperate, but the moment the first bite touched my tongue, something inside me cracked, and tears slid down my face before I could stop them. The worker didn't look away, or pretend not to notice. She simply placed a hand on my shoulder, light and steady, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the food that broke me open. It was the realization that someone had cared enough to make it, to bring it, to offer it without judgment. I was still finishing the last of the fruit when the door creaked open again, this time without hesitation, and the little girl, the one whose life had intersected with mine in the coldest moment I had ever endured, stepped into the room. She wore a soft lavender sweater and carried a small stuffed bunny tucked beneath her arm, her curls bouncing slightly as she moved with the tentative confidence of a child exploring familiar ground. Her eyes landed on me, widening with recognition, and before I could even process the moment, she hurried across the room with an excitement so pure it felt like a warm wave crashing through the space between us. "You're the blanket man," she exclaimed, stopping right beside my bed with a breathless wonder that made my heart twist sharply. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught somewhere between disbelief and emotion. She reached out, placing her small hand on mine with the certainty only a child can have, as though she had already decided who I was to her, as though my act of kindness had written me into her world in ink that could not be erased. "You saved me," she said, voice softening into something reverent, something impossibly sincere. "Daddy said you helped me when I got lost. He said you're a hero. Hero." No one had ever called me that. I had been called homeless, jobless, forgotten, invisible, but never anything that suggested I mattered. Her words hit me with a force I couldn't shield myself from, and I swallowed hard, trying to keep myself steady as she climbed onto the chair beside me, still holding my hand, as though afraid I might vanish if she let go. She told me about the party she had wandered away from, how she had been scared, how the world felt too big and too cold until someone warm wrapped her in a blanket that smelled like survival and kindness. And as she spoke, I noticed movement near the doorway. The billionaire stood there quietly, watching his granddaughter and me with an expression I didn't understand at first, one carved with grief and hope, with gratitude and something deeper, something like longing for a world that no longer existed for him. He didn't interrupt her. He didn't step in. He simply absorbed the moment as though it were sacred, as though watching us together allowed him to breathe differently. When she finally released my hand to fix her bunny's crooked ear, he stepped into the room fully, clearing his throat gently. There was a heaviness in the air, a shift so subtle yet profound that I knew something significant was coming even before he spoke. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, his gaze fixed on me rather than the room around us. "And I need to ask you something." I straightened instinctively, unsure whether to brace myself for gratitude or obligation, or worse, nothing at all. "Would you consider—" He paused, choosing his words with care. "A permanent role in our home?" His granddaughter looked up at me with hopeful eyes, just as he finished. "I believe our lives may need you more than you realize." For a long moment after he spoke, after he asked whether I would consider a permanent role in their home, I couldn't form a single coherent thought. Because the idea of permanence, the idea of belonging anywhere for more than a night, collided violently with the years I had spent drifting like a shadow through places where I was barely tolerated, let alone wanted. His granddaughter looked at me with a softness that made my chest tighten, her small hand still resting near mine, as if she'd already decided the answer for both of us. But my mind churned with a fear that had lived in me far longer than hope ever had, and all I could think about was how kindness from strangers often came with an invisible hook that only revealed itself once you were too entangled to escape. He explained the job gently, speaking not like a businessman offering employment, but like a grandfather offering a role that had a gravity beyond any title. Caretaker, mentor, companion, someone who could keep her grounded and safe in ways even his vast resources couldn't accomplish. He talked about trust, stability, and how she had already chosen me with the uncomplicated certainty of a child who doesn't question her own heart. But the more he spoke, the tighter the knot inside me became. And that familiar urge, the one that had saved me countless times on the streets, rose in my throat like a warning. If something feels too good to be true, it usually is. I tried to speak, to tell him that I wasn't qualified for anything, that I didn't have the skills or the background or even the dignity left to take on a role that mattered. But my voice faltered under the weight of everything I'd lived through. Because no matter how warm this mansion felt, no matter how comforting the breakfast had been, no matter how gentle the staff appeared, I had been burned too many times by promises that looked like salvation until they turned into traps. People in suits had smiled before ruining my life. People with wealth had spoken kindly before leaving me without warning. People I trusted had told me they believed in me, right before they stopped answering my calls and let my life fall apart, piece by piece. He must have sensed the storm inside me, because his expression shifted from hopeful to contemplative, and he sat down, giving me a space to breathe while not letting the moment slip away. "You're wondering why you," he said calmly, as if reading every fear in my eyes. "You're wondering why someone like me would trust someone like you." I swallowed hard, because that was exactly the thought screaming inside my head. Why would a billionaire hand his granddaughter to a man who had nothing left? Why would someone with endless options pick me? Before I could respond, memories broke open inside me like old wounds, memories I had kept locked away because thinking about them too closely felt like reopening scar tissue that had barely healed. I saw flashes of my old office, fluorescent lights buzzing softly while I typed reports with the quiet pride of someone who believed he was building a future. I saw the day everything ended, my supervisor calling me in with regret already forming in her eyes, the company downsizing, the economy twisting lives in its fist, and my job slipping out from under me like sand through fingers too numb to hold on. I saw the eviction notice, the storage unit that held everything I owned until I couldn't even afford that. The slow erosion of my dignity as one rejection followed another until I stopped applying, because hope had become a luxury I couldn't feed. Those memories flooded me so quickly they made my breath feel shallow, and when I finally spoke, my voice trembled with truths I had never admitted out loud. I told him about the job loss, the impossible bills, the downward spiral that followed, and how each time I trusted someone's promise, whether it was a quick job, a temporary shelter, or a helping hand, it ended with me more broken than before. By the time I finished, silence hung between us like a fragile curtain, and I waited for his expression to shift into pity or discomfort or quiet dismissal. But it didn't. Instead, something unexpected flickered across his face. Understanding, empathy, the kind of sorrow found only in people who have lost something too big to explain. He leaned forward, his hands clasped, and said softly, "I know what it means to lose everything, and I know what it means to believe that the next good thing might destroy you." His words struck me harder than any memory, because they carried a truth I didn't expect from someone with his wealth. Pain does not discriminate, and grief lives even in houses with marble floors and chandeliers. Before I could respond, a small tug at my sleeve drew my attention downward. His granddaughter looked up at me with eyes full of quiet certainty, her hand gripping mine as though anchoring me in place. "I want you to stay," she murmured, her voice carrying a purity that cut through every defense I had left. "You kept me safe when I was scared." Her words wrapped around my heart with a gentleness that hurt, because choosing to stay meant choosing hope, and hope had betrayed me before. But choosing to leave meant breaking something fragile in her that didn't deserve another fracture. I sat there struggling, suspended between fear and possibility, unable to make my mind or my heart settle on a single answer. That was when the billionaire stood, walked to a nearby desk, and retrieved a sealed envelope. Thick, heavy, marked with my name in handwriting that suggested careful intent. He handed it to me with a gravity that made my pulse stutter. "There's something inside this envelope," he said quietly, "and once you read it, you will finally understand that I know exactly who you are and exactly what you've survived." For several seconds after he placed the envelope in my hands, I simply stared at it, unable to comprehend why something so small, so deceptively ordinary, suddenly felt heavier than any weight I had carried on my shoulders during the long months I spent drifting through the cold. The paper was thick, the seal pressed with precise intention, and my name written across the front in a careful, steady script that didn't match his hurried business signature. I didn't know whether to be afraid of it, grateful for it, or both, because nothing in my life had ever arrived sealed, chosen, and handed to me with the kind of quiet seriousness usually reserved for life-altering truths. My fingers trembled as I broke the seal, and the moment I opened the flap, documents began to spill into my lap. Papers stamped, printed, notarized, highlighted, each one carrying a weight of its own, each one representing a wound I had tried to forget existed. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. There were medical records from the clinic where I had been treated for frostbite 2 years earlier, records I could barely bring myself to read back then. Behind them were the debt statements I had stopped opening, the collection warnings that became so aggressive I finally tore them up to stop the humiliation. There were notices from shelters, employment offices, and recovery programs I never got to complete because life kept pulling me back under. All the ghosts of my failures, neatly stacked, painfully familiar. But when I looked closer, something didn't make sense. Every document, every single page had a stamp on it, a red stamp, paid, cleared, resolved, settled, closed, one after another, again and again, pages I had once been terrified to open now rendered powerless, all carrying that same bold, impossible word. I felt the air leave my lungs so abruptly that I almost doubled over. I don't understand, I whispered, flipping through them in a frantic, confused motion, the pile slipping from my shaking hands. Why, who did this? I did, he said simply, as though he were confessing to nothing more than buying a cup of coffee. Every debt you carried, every bill hanging over your head, every record that kept you chained to a life you didn't deserve. It's gone. His calmness only made my panic worse. I gripped the papers as tears blurred the words, as the room seemed to tilt slightly under the weight of a future I never imagined possible. My throat tightened, and something inside me, some old, buried piece of pride, shame, gratitude, and disbelief, snapped at once. I broke. Not in the small, quiet way I often broke on the streets when no one was watching, but in a way I couldn't contain. My body shook as years of fear and exhaustion and hopelessness tore through me in a storm I no longer knew how to hold back. I didn't earn this, I choked out. You don't even know me. You don't know the mistakes I've made. You don't know. He lifted a hand gently, cutting through my spiraling thoughts with a single look filled not with pity, but with recognition. You think kindness has to be earned, he said softly. But sometimes it's given because someone sees something you've forgotten about yourself. Before I could respond, before I could even begin to process what that meant, the head housekeeper stepped closer, her expression warm with a mixture of respect and quiet sincerity. I've worked for him for 15 years, she said. I've seen him help charities, children's hospitals, disaster victims. But something like this? She gestured toward the pile of cleared records in my lap. He doesn't do this for people. Not like this. Not personally. Her voice softened. He only does it when he feels something deeply. Her words didn't comfort me. They terrified me. Because if a man like him had gone to such lengths, then surely he wanted something in return. Something I wouldn't be able to give. Something that would cost more than the debts ever had. I felt myself curling inward, struggling to breathe under a tidal wave of guilt and unworthiness. I can't repay this, I whispered. I have nothing. Not money, not stability, not anything. He didn't flinch. He didn't look disappointed. He simply shook his head. I didn't do it because I wanted something back, he said. I did it because you showed me something I haven't seen in a very long time. I shook my head, confused, overwhelmed, lost inside a generosity that felt too enormous, too undeserved, too fragile. But why me? I asked. Out of everyone in the world, why me? He studied me with an intensity I had never felt from another human being, an expression filled with memory, loss, and something far deeper than gratitude. His voice lowered to a near whisper, weighed with emotion that seemed to rise from somewhere raw inside him. There's a deeper reason I chose you, he said quietly, almost as if he was afraid of his own words. A reason I haven't told you yet. And once I show you the truth, he continued, a shadow crossing his face, your entire life, Your past, your present, and everything you thought you lost will never look the same again." The room felt heavier after his words, as though the air itself had thickened with something unspoken. And while the envelope lay open across my lap like a vessel carrying pieces of the life I'd once lost, the billionaire stood before me with a stillness that told me he was preparing to reveal something carved deeply into the most painful place a person can hold a memory. I didn't move, not because I wasn't overwhelmed, I was drowning, but because I sensed this was not the kind of story a man shares lightly. And whatever he was about to tell me had been locked inside him for far longer than my debts or my struggles ever existed. He walked toward the tall window at the far end of the room, the afternoon light outlining his silhouette in a way that made him look simultaneously powerful and unbearably human. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an exhaustion that wasn't physical, but emotional, an ache that had settled into him years ago and never truly left. "My daughter," he began, "was the kind of person the world notices for reasons they never fully understand. She wasn't loud, she wasn't proud, she wasn't the kind of child who demanded attention. Yet somehow, everywhere she went, people felt lighter around her." He paused, his hands tightening behind his back as if steadying himself. "She had this way of giving, not because she wanted praise or recognition, but because she seemed to believe, truly believe, that her purpose was to ease the burdens of others." He turned his head slightly, his gaze drifting toward a framed photograph on the far wall, one I hadn't noticed in the chaos of earlier moments. A young woman smiled back at him from the picture, her expression so full of warmth that even from across the room, I felt a small wave of something soft and familiar settle over me. "She was like you," he whispered, the words almost trembling. "More than you realize." My breath caught, surprised and unsure. No one had compared me to anyone admirable in years. No one had looked at me and seen anything worth connecting to a memory so cherished. But he continued before I could speak, as though the story had been waiting too long to be freed. "When she was 15, he said, "she started volunteering at shelters, at clinics, at any place where she felt she could make someone else's world a little less heavy. I used to scold her for it, told her she was giving too much of herself, told her she needed to focus on her future, her safety, her education. But she would just look at me with those calm, steady eyes and say, 'Dad, what good is my future if I don't help someone else get to theirs?'" His voice cracked, barely perceptible but unmistakably real. I felt something shift inside me, a soft, painful recognition of a child I never met, but could somehow imagine clearly. "She grew up," he continued, "and she didn't lose that spirit. Even when she entered businesses and rooms filled with ambition, competition, power, none of it changed her. She still stopped to speak to the janitors, still gave away her coats to the homeless outside her building, still carried granola bars in her bag because she said she didn't like passing people who might be hungry." He exhaled sharply, shoulders sagging as though the memories weighed him down. "But goodness like hers, it's fragile, it needs protection, and I failed her." He pressed a hand against the window frame, his knuckles whitening as guilt rippled across his voice. "She trusted someone who didn't deserve her, someone who took advantage of her kindness, drained her emotionally, and when she finally tried to distance herself, he didn't take it well." He paused again, the silence stretching heavy and long, until he finally said the words that chilled the room. "She's gone." I swallowed hard, a painful lump forming in my throat as the weight of his confession settled over both of us. He remained facing the window, but I could see his reflection, the sorrow etched into every line of his face, the regret that still held him captive. "Losing her," he whispered, "destroyed pieces of me I didn't know could break. And for years after, I looked for her everywhere, in gestures, in stories, in the rare moments when a stranger did something selfless without expecting anything back. But goodness like hers isn't easy to find." He turned toward me fully now, his eyes red-rimmed, not from weakness but from the kind of grief that reshapes a soul. "That night," he said softly, "when I saw the security footage of you wrapping your only blanket around my granddaughter, watching her run off with the only thing keeping you alive, I saw my daughter in you, not your face, not your clothing, your spirit." My throat felt tight, my vision blurring with tears I hadn't expected to shed so freely. I wanted to protest, to insist I wasn't that good, that I had done nothing extraordinary, but the way he looked at me made arguing feel like betraying something sacred. "That's why I helped you," he continued. "Not because you were desperate, not because you were broken, but because for the first time in years, someone reminded me of who my daughter was, of what she believed in, of the kind of light she carried." He stepped closer, his voice growing steadier despite the emotion still trembling within it. "And that's why I believe meeting you was not chance, not coincidence, but fate." The room went still, the words settling inside me like a seed of something I hadn't dared feel in years. Purpose, possibility, maybe even belonging. He lowered himself into the chair across from me, leaning forward with a sincerity so powerful it left no room for doubt. "Now I need to ask you something," he said quietly, his eyes locked onto mine. "Something more important than the job offer." I held my breath, the air between us charged with anticipation. "Will you let me help rebuild your life? Because if you allow it," he added, voice deepening with conviction, "I promise you, this time you will not lose everything again." Moving into the mansion, even temporarily, felt less like stepping into safety, and more like walking into a world so polished and untouched that every time my shoes crossed a marble floor or I passed a glimmering chandelier, I found myself shrinking inside my own skin, painfully aware that nothing in this place had ever been built with someone like me in mind. The guest suite they prepared was bigger than every room I'd lived in since losing my apartment combined, and the softness of the mattress, the warmth of the lights, the quiet hum of heat moving through the vents all unsettled me, because comfort, in my experience, had never arrived without a price, and I didn't yet know what this one would be. The staff, however, treated me with a gentleness so consistent it almost frightened me more than indifference would have. On my first morning, the head housekeeper brought me a set of clothes, well-fitted, clean, new, and although I hesitated before touching them, she placed the folded stack in my hands with a confidence that told me she expected no argument. A barber came to trim my hair and beard, insisting I sit still while he worked, and the image staring back at me in the mirror afterward looked so foreign, I wasn't sure whether to be relieved or afraid. A therapist the billionaire trusted visited twice a week, offering me a space to unravel parts of myself I had kept tightly shut for years. And though speaking about the nights I nearly froze, or the humiliation of begging for work made my hands shake uncontrollably, something inside me loosened each time I walked out of her office. But it wasn't the staff, or the therapy, or the clothes that made the mansion feel less like a gilded cage and more like a place where I might eventually breathe. It was the little girl. She visited me every afternoon, bursting into the guest room without knocking, carrying crayons, picture books, stuffed animals, or stories about the day she had at school, and she listened to my stories with a seriousness far beyond her years. She asked questions about how cold it really felt behind the train station, how I survived nights when the wind cut through layers like knives, how I kept believing morning would come even when I wasn't sure it would. I tried to soften the edges of the truth, but she always sensed when I held back, squeezing my hand and urging me to tell her the real version, not the kid version, as she called it. Those conversations connected us in ways I couldn't have predicted. She didn't see me as a man who had lost everything, but as someone who had fought the darkness and made it through. And the billionaire watched those moments quietly from a distance whenever he could, his expression softening each time she ran to me first, instead of him, her trust in me growing as naturally as breathing. Still, healing wasn't smooth or pretty or predictable. Some nights I woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding violently, mind dragging me back to places I never wanted to relive. The cold, the hunger, the sound of footsteps that could mean danger or salvation. During one dinner, a plate clattered accidentally, and the sharp sound sent me into a panic I couldn't control. My chest tightened, the room blurred, and I stumbled out to the garden gasping for air. I expected frustration or disappointment, but instead the billionaire followed me outside, placing a steady hand on my back and simply breathing with me until my pulse slowed, telling me with quiet certainty that healing wasn't linear, that nothing about my reactions made me weak. Over time, those moments grew less frequent. I learned the rhythm of the household. I learned how to walk through hallways without flinching, how to sit at the long dining table without feeling like an intruder, how to accept that kindness didn't always hide a second motive. Slowly, too slowly for me to notice at first, I began to regain parts of myself I had long assumed were gone forever. Confidence arrived in delicate fragments. The first time I laughed without forcing it. The first time I looked in the mirror and recognized the man staring back. The first time I believed that perhaps I was not a charity project or a temporary obligation, but someone who could contribute something meaningful to a world larger than my pain. Yet even with all this progress, a part of me remained cautious, lingering at the edges of rooms, hesitant to fully claim a place that didn't belong to me. I feared that one wrong move, one misinterpreted moment, one reminder of who I had been before stepping into this mansion would send me back to the streets, stripped again of everything this family had given me. It was during one of those cautious mornings, when I lingered in the hallway near the kitchen, reluctant to join the bustling breakfast preparations, that I heard two staff members whispering behind the partially open pantry door. Their voices were hushed but urgent, and my name drifted through the gap with clarity that made my heart lurch. "Have you heard what he's planning?" one of them murmured. "He hasn't said it officially," the other replied, "but the way he talks about him, the way he watches over him, I think it's true." "What? What is he planning?" A pause. A sigh. Then the words that made my blood run cold. "He wants to adopt him." And as silence crashed through me, I realized they weren't talking about the granddaughter. They were talking about me. For hours after overhearing the staff's whispered conversation, my mind spun in circles so tight and frantic that I could barely breathe. Because the idea that a billionaire, a man with power, legacy, reputation, and more options than I could ever comprehend, might be considering adopting someone like me felt so outrageous, so impossible, so heavy with implications I wasn't ready to face, that I avoided him entirely until he finally cornered me in the garden with a patience that carried more understanding than accusation. His tone was calm, his eyes steady, as he told me to sit. And though my chest tightened with anxiety, I lowered myself onto the bench across from him, bracing for a conversation I feared would reshape the fragile stability I had just begun to rebuild. "I heard something," I began quietly, unable to mask the tremor in my voice. "And I need to know if it's true." He exhaled slowly, his expression softening in a way that told me he already guessed what rumor had reached me. "You heard the staff discussing adoption," he said, not accusingly, not defensively, but with a calm transparency that immediately disarmed part of my fear. "And before you spiral or misinterpret anything, let me make something absolutely clear." He leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle yet firm. "I don't want to adopt you, not because you're unworthy, but because you don't need another father. You need a partner, someone who will walk beside you, not lead you. Someone who respects you as an equal, not as a dependent. Someone who sees you as a man with strength, purpose, and a future you deserve to shape. Not someone who needs to be rescued through paperwork." His words washed over me with a relief so intense it almost hurt, because the thought of being adopted at my age, of surrendering the autonomy I was only starting to reclaim, terrified me more than returning to the streets ever had. Yet the reassurance in his tone soothed the bruised edges of my pride, reminding me that he saw me not as broken or unfinished, but as someone capable of standing on his own feet again. He continued, "What I do want is to build something meaningful with you. Something that helps people who lived the life you survived. Something that honors my daughter's spirit and the kindness you showed my granddaughter." He handed me a folder from the table beside him, and when I opened it, I stared at the documents inside. Proposals, plans, outlines, all centered around expanding his charity foundation, with a new division focused on homelessness, rehabilitation, and emergency aid. And at the top of those documents, highlighted in thick ink, was a title beside my name: Director of Outreach and Recovery. "I want you to take this role," he said, his voice full of conviction. "Not because I pity you, but because there are people out there who will listen to your voice, trust your experience, and believe in a comeback only you can show them. You survived what most never could, and that makes you uniquely capable of reaching the people who need us most." My throat tightened, emotion rising so quickly I had to look away to keep from falling apart in front of him. The idea that my suffering, my failures, my nights on frozen concrete could become more than scars, that they could become a lifeline for someone else, hit me with a force I wasn't prepared for. Days turned into weeks, and I found myself stepping into the role with a mixture of fear and determination. Visiting shelters, speaking with struggling families, sharing pieces of my story when appropriate, and realizing that each time I spoke, something in me healed a little more. I watched people's faces shift from despair to possibility, watched them lean forward, hungry for proof that a life broken in half could be rebuilt into something strong. And each time they asked how I ended up here, I pointed to the billionaire's granddaughter, who always ran to me in the evenings with her artwork or school stories, calling me uncle, with the kind of affection that anchored me more deeply than any paycheck or title ever could. My days filled with purpose, my nights with peace. And slowly, I understood that family doesn't always arrive in the form you expect. Sometimes it finds you in the cold, wrapped in a blanket you gave away without thinking. One evening, after returning from a long day of visiting shelters, I walked into the mansion and found the billionaire waiting for me near the staircase, holding something small and gleaming in his hand. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he studied me, with the kind of pride usually reserved for parents watching their children achieve something greater than themselves. Then he stepped forward, pressed the cold metal into my palm, and closed my fingers around it with deliberate care. "It's time," he said softly, a hint of emotion threading through his voice. "It's yours now." When I opened my hand and saw the key glistening under the chandelier, I realized he wasn't giving me something small. He was giving me something that could change everything. The key felt surprisingly heavy in my palm, heavier than metal should ever feel, as though the weight inside it wasn't physical, but something older. Something made from years of longing and loss, and quiet prayers whispered into nights that had never once answered back. And as the billionaire motioned for me to follow him out to the waiting car, my heart pounded with a confusion so tangled I could barely breathe. We drove in silence through winding streets lined with old trees and quiet houses, neighborhoods far gentler than any place I had slept in for years. And with every mile we passed, my mind raced through possibilities, none of which came close to the truth waiting for me at the end of the road. When the car finally stopped in front of a small house tucked beneath the branches of a sprawling oak tree, I felt the world tilt just slightly, because the house didn't look new or intimidating or extravagant the way the mansion did. It looked lived in, gentle, familiar, almost as if it had been waiting for someone who had forgotten how to belong anywhere. The paint was a warm shade of blue, the porch framed with soft yellow lights glowing in the early evening, and the garden, modest, tidy, filled with lavender and tiny stepping stones, reminded me of the places I used to walk through on my best days, long before life broke open beneath my feet. The billionaire placed a steady hand on my shoulder and nodded toward the door. "Go on," he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "It's yours." Even then, I hesitated, because gifts this large, this permanent, felt impossible, dangerous, unreal. But he stepped back, giving me space, and I finally lifted the key with hands that trembled more with fear than with excitement. The lock clicked open with a familiar sound that made my chest ache sharply, and when the door swung inward, I felt my breath stop entirely. The house wasn't empty. It wasn't cold. It wasn't waiting to be filled with life. It already held life. My life. There was a soft brown couch set near a sunlit window, the exact shade I used to have in my old apartment before everything was taken. A bookshelf stood against the far wall, not filled randomly but lined with the same titles I once owned. Books I had loved, lost, forgotten, now restored as though someone had collected the fragments of my past and given them back to me carefully, piece by piece. The kitchen smelled faintly of vanilla, and there were coffee mugs on the counter in styles I remembered choosing years ago, back when I still thought I knew who I was. A jacket hung by the doorway, simple and warm, in the exact size I wore. Every detail, every room, every quiet corner felt like someone had listened to my life, taken notes, and then built a home around what I had once cherished. I turned toward the billionaire, but emotion hit me so violently that the words tangled in my throat before I could speak. Tears blurred my vision, hot and uncontrollable, and I leaned against the wall for support, covering my face with trembling hands as everything inside me cracked. Years of cold, fear, humiliation, and hopelessness breaking open all at once beneath the overwhelming warmth of what stood before me. "This," he said quietly from behind me, "is a home for a man who gave when he had nothing left to give." I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know how to hold so much gratitude without drowning in it. My voice failed me entirely, leaving only the sound of my breath shaking through the quiet house. Then a small voice drifted from the doorway. "Do you like it?" I turned to see his granddaughter standing there with a canvas clutched to her chest, paint smudged across her fingers like tiny badges of pride. She ran toward me with the unrestrained joy only children can muster, holding out the painting with both hands. It showed the two of us. Me with my tattered blanket, her wrapped inside it, glowing with warmth. And above us, in bright, uneven letters, she had written, "Thank you for saving me." Something inside me shattered into 1,000 softened pieces. Not from pain, not from sorrow, but from a love so unexpected it felt like a second chance made into sunlight. As I knelt to hug her, letting her tiny arms wrap around my neck, I realized that this house wasn't just shelter. It was belonging. It was dignity returned. It was the first place in years where the walls didn't echo with absence. And then, just as I finally began to breathe again, just as my heart settled into this unfamiliar warmth, a soft knock sounded at the door. The billionaire stepped forward to open it, and I saw a courier holding a single envelope, plain and unmarked except for the name written across the front. My name. Written in handwriting I recognized instantly. Handwriting I hadn't seen in years. The courier handed it over gently, saying, "It's from someone from your past." And in that moment my entire world, this new home, this fragile peace, this unexpected family, suddenly felt like it was about to collide with everything I thought I had left behind forever. When I first held the letter in my hands, its edges trembling slightly between my fingers, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. The old instinct that told me anything from my past would bring punishment before it brought comfort, that the life I once lived had nothing left to offer except reminders of how far I had fallen. The envelope was simple, almost delicate, addressed in handwriting I hadn't seen in years, handwriting that pulled a memory out of the fog with such clarity that my breath caught somewhere between yearning and fear. I opened it slowly, unfolding the paper with a caution that made the moment stretch longer than time itself. And as my eyes moved across the first line, my name written with affection instead of accusation, I felt the ground shift beneath me. It was a letter from a relative I had lost touch with long before homelessness became part of my story. Someone who had searched for me through shelters and hospitals. Someone who feared I had disappeared in ways no one escaped from. They wrote about missed holidays, about unanswered calls, about the ache of not knowing whether I was alive or buried beneath the city's indifference. And as I read the words trembling with relief, regret, and hope, they told me they had never stopped looking for me, never stopped believing I was still out there, never stopped wanting me to come home. The message was simple. We miss you. We want to see you. We're here whenever you're ready. The reunion that followed came in a blur of long drives, hesitant embraces, shared silence, and careful conversations. I won't describe the details, not because they were unimportant, but because some reunions carry a quiet sacredness that can't fit neatly into a story meant to be shared. What matters is this. I was not alone in the world the way I once feared. I had not been forgotten. And the scars I carried, emotional, physical, invisible, didn't repulse the people who had once known me. Instead, they held me with a tenderness I had never expected to feel again. They welcomed the man I had become, not the one I felt ashamed of. That was enough. Now, when I step out of the small blue house that waited for me like a promise fulfilled, I feel my feet sink into soil that belongs to me, ground that carries the weight of my second chance without buckling beneath it. My days unfold with a gentle certainty I once believed was reserved for people who never lost their way. I wake to warmth instead of cold, to purpose instead of dread, to a life that feels steady beneath my hands. My work at the foundation fills my hours with meaning, real meaning, not the frantic survival of the streets, but impact measured in faces, in stories, in moments where someone's hopelessness shifts into possibility because they hear my voice say, "I've been where you are, and you're not done yet." The billionaire, once a distant figure coated in marble and power, has become something far more human in my life. A man who speaks to me not from above, but beside, who listens when I break and celebrates when I rise, someone whose grief softened into purpose the moment our paths crossed in the coldest night of my life. His granddaughter, with her paint-splattered hands and boundless trust, calls me uncle with a joy that rises like sunlight inside me. And each time she runs into my arms or shows me another drawing, usually of the three of us, I feel my heart rebuild itself in ways I never imagined possible. I belong somewhere again, not as charity, not as pity, but as family, chosen through kindness instead of blood. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the world slows and the hum of the foundation's work fades into night, I sit on my porch with a cup of warm tea and think about the Tay version of myself who almost died behind a train station. The man who thought his story had ended when the cold wrapped itself around him like a final curtain. I think about the thin gray blanket I placed around a frightened child, not knowing it was the single act that would carry me into a life too vast and gentle to imagine. I think about how one moment of kindness, offered freely, without expectation, unraveled every chain around my future and rewrote it with light instead of darkness. And now, writing the final lines of this chapter in my life, I understand something I never understood before. The man I am today isn't someone I stumbled into becoming. He is someone shaped by grace, by unexpected love, by the kind of miracles that grow quietly inside moments we barely notice. I am no longer a man defined by loss, but by the life I rebuilt, and the people who helped rebuild me. So as I stand in the doorway of the home that changed everything, looking out at a world that once felt too cold to survive, I ask myself the question that has lived inside me ever since that night beneath the train station lights. If one blanket could change my entire life, what can one act of kindness change in yours? If this story touched something deep inside you, tell me in the comments which moment stayed with you the longest.